meek, and abased by this consciousness of the one eternal, omnipresent, perfect reality, his soul took up again her burden of piteous masses and prayers and sacraments and mortifications, and only then, for the first time, since he had brooded on the great mysteries of love, did he feel within him a warm movement, like that of some newly born life or virtue of the soul itself. Departed the attitude of rapture in sacred art, the raised and parted hands, the parted lips, the parted eyes as of one about to swoon, became for him an image of the soul in prayer. Humiliated and faint before her Creator. But he had been forewarned of the dangers of the spiritual exhalation and did not allow himself to desist from even the least or lowliest devotion, striving also by a constant mortifications to undo the sinful past, rather than to achieve a saintliness fraught with peril. Each of his senses was brought under a rigorous discipline, in order to mortify the sense of sight he made it his rule to walk in a street with downcast eyes, glancing neither to right nor left, and never behind him. His eyes shunned every encounter with the eyes of the women. From time to time also he balked them by a sudden effort of the will, as by lifting them suddenly in the middle of an unfinished sentence, and closing the book. To mortify his hearing, he exerted no control over his voice, which was then breaking. Neither sang nor whistled, and made no attempt to flee from noise, which caused him a painful nervous irritation. such as the sharpening of knives on the knife board, the gathering of the cinders on a fire shovel, and the tweaking of the carpet to mortify his smell was more difficult as he found in himself no instinctive repugnance to bad odors, whether they were the odors of the outdoor world, such as those of dung or tar, or the odors of his own person, among which he had made many curious comparisons and experiments. He found in the end that the only odor against which his sense of smell revolted was a certain stale fishy stink like that of long standing urine. And whenever it was poisonable, he subjected himself to this unpleasant odor. To mortify the state he practiced strict habit at the table, observed to the letter all the fast of the church, and sought by distractions to divert his mind from the savours of a different food. But it was to mortification of touch that he brought the most serious ingenuity of inventiveness. He never consciously changed his position in bed. Sat in the most uncomfortable positions, suffered patiently every itch and pain, kept away from the fire, remained on his knees all through the Mass except at the Gospels, left parts of his neck and face undried so that air might sting them. And whenever he was not saying his beads, carried his arms stiffly at his sides, like a runner, and never in his pockets or clasped behind him. He had no temptations to sin mortally. It surprised him, however, to find that at the end of his course of intricate piety and self-restraint, He was so easily at the mercy of childish and unworthy imperfections. His prayers and fast availed him little for the suppressions of anger at hearing his mother sneeze, or at being disturbed in his devotion. It needed an immense effort of his will to master the impulse, which urged him to give outlet to such irritation. Images of the outburst of trivial anger, which he had often noted among his masters, their twitching mouth, close-shut lips, and flushed cheeks, recurred to his memory, discouraging him. For all his practice of humility, by the comparison, to merge his life in a common tide of other lives was harder for him than any fasting of or prayer. And it was his constant failure to do this to his own satisfaction which caused in his soul at last a sensation of the spiritual dryness, together with the growth of doubts and scruples. His soul traversed a period of desolation, in which the sacraments themselves seemed to have turned into dried up sources. His confession became a channel for the escape of scrupulous and unrepentant imperfections. His actual receptions of the Eucharist did not bring him the same dissolving moments of the virginal self-surrender as did those spiritual communion made by him sometimes. At the close of some visit to the Blessed Sacrament. The book which he used for these visits was an old neglected book written by Saint Alphonsus Laguerre, with fading characters and sere fox-papered leaves. A faded world of fervent love and virginal responses seemed to be evoked for his soul by the reading of its pages in which the imagery of the countenance was interwoven with the communicant prayers. An inaudible voice seemed to curse the soul, telling her names and glorious, bidding her arise as for a spoil and come away, bidding her look forth a spouse from a Maina and from the mountain of the leopards. And the soul seemed to answer with the same inaudible voice, surrendering herself. Inter ubera mi comure behter. This idea of surrender had a perilous attraction for his mind. Now that he felt his soul beset once again by the insistent voice of the flesh, which began to murmur to him again during his prayers and meditations. It gave him an intense sense of power. To know that he could, by a single act of consent, in a moment of thought, undo all that he had done. He seemed to feel a flood, slowly advancing towards his naked feet, and to be waiting for the first faint, timid, noiseless wavelet to touch his fevered skin. Then, almost at the instant of that touch, almost at the verge of the sinful consent, he found himself standing far away from the flood, upon a dry shore, saved by a sudden act of the will or a sudden ejaculation, and seeing the silver line of the floor, far away and beginning again. Its slow advance towards his feet, a new thrill of power and satisfaction, shook his soul to know that he had not yielded nor undone all. When he had allowed the flood of temptations many times, in this way he grew troubled and wondered whether the grace which he had refused to lose was not being filched from him little by little, The clear certitude of his own immunity grew dim, and to it succeeded a vague fear that his soul had really fallen on unawares. It was with difficulty that he won back his old consciousness of his state of grace by telling himself that he had prayed to God at every temptation, and that the grace which he had prayed for the most have been given to him inasmuch as God was obligated to give it. The very frequency and violence of temptations showed him at last the truth of what he had heard about the trials of the saints. Frequent and violent temptations were a proof that the citadel of the soul had not fallen, and that the devil raged to make it fall. Often, when he had confessed his doubts and scruples, some momentary inattention at prayer, a movement of trivial anger in his soul, or subtle willfulness in speech or act. He was bidden by his confessor to name some sin of his past life before absolution was given him. He named it with humility and shame, and repented of it once more. It humiliated and shamed him to think that he would never be freed from it wholly, however holily he might live, or whatever virtues or perfections he might attain. A restless feeling of guilt would always be present with him. He would confess and repent and be absolved. Confess and repent again and be absolved again. Fruitlessly. Perhaps that first hasty confession wrung from him by the fear of hell had not been good. Perhaps concerned only for his imminent doom. He had not had sincere sorrow for his sin, but the surest sign that his confession had been good, and that he had sincere sorrow for his sin was, he knew the amendment of his life. I have amended my life, have I not? He asked himself. The director stood in an embrasure of the window, his back to the light. Leaning an elbow on the brown cross blind. And as he spoke and smiled, slowly dangling and looping the cord of the other blind, Stephen stood before him, following for a moment with his eyes the waning of the long summer daylight. Above the roofs or the slow dipped moments of the priestly fingers. The priest's face was in a total shadow, but the waning daylight from behind him touched the deeply grown temples and the curves of the skull. Stephen followed also with his ears. The accent and intervals of the priest's voice. As he spoke gravely and cordially of indifferent themes. The vacation which had just ended, the colleges of the order abroad, the transference of masters, the grave and cordial voice went on easily with its tale. And in the pauses, Stephen felt bound to set it on again with a respectful questions. He knew that the tale was a prelude, and his mind waited for the sequel. Ever since the message of summons had come for him from the director, his mind has struggled to find the meaning of the message. And during the long restless time he had sat in a college parlor, waiting for a director to come in his eyes. Had wandered from one sober picture to another, around the walls, and his mind wandered from one guest to another, until the meaning of the summons had almost become clear. Then, just as he was wishing that some unforeseen cause might prevent the director from coming, he had heard the handle of the door turning and a swish of a sultan. The director had begun to speak of the Dominican and Francations, orders, and of the friendship between Saint Thomas and Saint Bonaventure. The Capuchin dress, he thought, was a rather too Stephen's face gave back the prized, indulgent smile, and not being anxious to give an opinion, he made a slight dubitative movement with his lips. I believe, continued the director, that there is some talk now among the Capuchins themselves of doing away with it and following the example of the other Frankish counts. I suppose they would retain it in the cloisters, said Stephen. Oh, certainly, said the director. For the cloister it is all right. But for the street, I really think it would be better to do away with, don't you? It must be troublesome, I imagine. Of course it is, of course. Just imagine when I was in Belgium, I used to see them out cycling in all kinds of weather. With these things up about their knees. It was really ridiculous. Les jupes, they call them in Belgium. The vowel was so modified as to be indistinct. What do they call them? List GPS. Stephen smiled again in answer to the smile which he could not see on the priest's shadowed face. Its image or spectre only. Passing rapidly across his mind as the low, discreet accent fell upon his ear. He gazed calmly before him at the waning sky, glad of the cool of the evening, at the faint yellow glow which hid the tiny flame kindling upon his cheek. The name of the article of dress worn by a woman, or of certain soft and delicate stuffs used in their making, brought always to his mind a delicate and a sinful perfume. As a boy he had imagined the reins by which horses are driven as slender silken bands, and it shocked him to feel at the Stradbrook the greasy leather of harness. It had shocked him, too, when he had felt for the first time beneath his tremulous fingers the brittle texture of the woman's stocking for retaining nothing of all he read, save that which seemed to him an echo or a prophecy of his own state. It was the only mild, soft-worded phrases or within rows of stuffs that he dared to conceive of the soul or body of the women moving with a tender life. But a phrase on a priest's lips was disingenuous, for he knew that a priest should not speak lightly on that theme. The phrase had been spoken lightly with a design, and he felt that his face was being searched by the eyes in shadow. This video is taken for Navi Daria's page.